What is going on, everybody? My name's Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and our team has been hard at work on a new update to the app that makes a lot of improvements to the way that you manage your entries, swap your lineups, and also deal with your exposure management and projection updates within a build. I'm going to walk through all of that here in this video, and I've got a lot to get to. So let's go ahead and dive right in and get to it. Okay, so what we have here is a 150 max build built on default settings for the NBA main slate on FanDuel for April 21st. A few things on this page that will probably look a little bit different to you guys if you are familiar with our tools. But what I want to start with is how we have streamlined the process of getting your lineups out of SaberSim and onto the sites. So on the upper right here, you can see we now have a fill entries button directly on the build screen. If we click this, we'll see somewhat of a familiar menu to upload the entries file. I already have mine downloaded, so I'll go ahead and just upload my entries here for tonight's slate. And now we get this new pop-up that allows us to fill our contests directly from the build screen. So I've got a 150 lineup build here. Perhaps maybe this is only for my 150 max contest, the piggy bank shot. I can go ahead and select the lineup set that is associated here with this. Pick the same fill methods that you guys are used to seeing here and click fill 150 entries. I can even download my entry file here. The download button will turn yellow when not all of your entries are filled. And if I were to fill everything, the download button will turn green, indicating that all of the different entries are filled. I can go ahead and download and upload directly to FanDuel from a particular build. If you are looking for the option to just download your lineups and not use the entry editor here, that button is still present. It's this green download button here, which will just download your lineups that you might already be familiar with. Ultimately, what this means is that you can probably get your lineups into your contests much quicker and much more efficiently than it used to be, because you can use the fill entries button directly from the build, fill your different contests as you're moving through your process, and as soon as you're ready, download your entries file without having to go over to the entry editor at all to get that done. Let's jump over to the entry editor and talk about some of the changes that we have made here. So the entry editor has had a little bit of a facelift as well. Going forward, you can treat this entries tab in particular here as more of kind of a home base. You aren't necessarily going to need to go here every single time you're building lineups with SaberSim. It's probably perfectly fine to just build your lineups, fill them from the build, and download from there. But if for some reason you need to go in here and double check things, make sure that your lineups are filled from the right contests or make adjustments there, you can come in here, pick different lineup sets and fill them into different contests as you are familiar with here. On the left-hand side, we have made some adjustments as well. And the left-hand side, the table of your exposures, are mostly useful at this point now here for research. You can go ahead and see different projections, the salaries, and the exposures you have to different players in your lineups. But you won't be making adjustments to your exposures or projections or anything like that in the entry editor anymore. And I'll show you why in just a moment. Before we get to that, though, I first want to just point out these two new columns here, lineup exposure and entry exposures here. Pretty cool. This has been a commonly requested thing for us to add here. Your lineup exposure is the percentage of unique lineups that have a certain player in it here. So in this case, we have a 150 lineup set, of which 72.7% include Nikola Jokic in it. However, since we used the rank fill method and the lineups at the top, the highest Saber score lineups are showing up more than once in our 3 max here, in the 9 lineups into the clutch shot, into the 20 and the 25 max here we see. Nikola Jokic is actually showing up in 79.2% of our entries. So we've broken up the exposures here as a way to see differently how different players are showing up in unique lineups versus unique entries. At this point here, you may be wondering what happened to the late swap button. And that's a really good question. We have changed the way that the late swap works as well here on the app to help streamline things and make them a little bit easier to use. So let's imagine here now that we have entered our lineups into the contest and we're midway through the slate, and then we get news that For example, Jalen Brunson has been ruled out, so we'll set his projection to 0. And as you can see up here, there's a new red lightning bolt button that turns red and kind of shakes a little bit here when a player in your entries file has since been ruled out. If you click this button, this will immediately initiate a quick swap. The easiest thing to do here will be to just click it, select all out players, and to swap with the best available player. And we can see in this case, we have now removed Jalen Brunson from our lineups, replacing him with all of these other players that have a higher overall projection. We wanted to make quick swap much more useful in terms of making it something that you can just automatically very quickly do when you have a player that is out in your lineups, and also a better alert tool so that it will actually alert you if you have a player in your lineups that has been ruled out. So we can go ahead and quick swap that way. The late swap is now actually pulled into the normal build tab. So to initiate a late swap, you'll go ahead and click the same plus icon here to start a new build as you're familiar with. But instead, we'll toggle the late swap toggle on here in the upper right. Because this slate hasn't actually started at the time I'm recording this, we get a message here saying, are you sure you want to late swap? Just to make sure you don't accidentally run a late swap when you have time before a build to run a full swap. But in this case, I'll go ahead and click yes. One thing to note here is that once the slate has actually started, and we know that the slate lock has already passed, when you open up the new build window, we will assume you want to late swap. So this will default to a late swap build, and you'll be able to see right at top in the big yellow letters that this is indeed a late swap. From here, we can pick what contests we are late swapping for. This is similar to how it used to work in the entry editor. If we want to run different late swaps for different builds, we can go ahead and identify which particular contests we are trying to swap here. But for the purposes of this, we'll go ahead and just swap everything together. We'll click Late Swap 150 Lineups, and this will initiate a late swap build, just like it does on the current app. Once this build is complete, we'll have the option to download our new entries here on the upper right, and we can get them up into FanDuel to upload and get the latest information up into our lineups. The last change that we've made here is around the way that exposure editing and projection adjustments work within a build. So if you're familiar with SaberSim, you know that historically your adjustments to min and max exposures and projections that you make here in the build screen are local to that build. If we adjust Jokic here to 50% maximum exposure, and then perhaps bump Gobert up to 45% projection, and perhaps set a minimum exposure for, I don't know, let's pick a random player here, Bogdanovic of 20%. These are all local to this build. Well, we do now have the ability to take your custom min and max exposures and projections and send them back to the home screen to use for future builds. And that is what this send button does. If you click this, you'll get the option to send either your custom projections from this build or your exposures or both back to the home tab. So I'll click both here. This will send a message here, and this is a very important note. This will overwrite any other exposures and projections you have on the home screen and replace them with what you're sending from this build. But if you're sure you want to do that, you can click Send, and then we'll navigate back to the home screen, and we can see the Gobert custom projection along with the minimum exposure for Bogdanovic, the maximum exposure for Jokic, have all reached the home screen here. We could now build a different set of lineups here and use the new min and max exposures and projections that were set on the home screen here as well. This can be very useful if you've spent a lot of time dialing in your exposures and projections on your build to get it exactly the way you want, and then shortly before a lock, news breaks, new simulations run, and you want to capture the information in those new simulations. Well, you can take the build that you worked hard on, send your exposures, projections, or both back home, and start over with a fresh build using those projections and exposures and so on. This is also very useful for late swap. If you have uploaded a new entries file, or if you just otherwise need to late swap, but you want to include the custom exposures that you had set before lock, you can come in here now, send the custom exposures from that build home, open up the new build screen, make sure you're using a late swap, and when you late swap, you'll go ahead and get the new updated lineups in accordance with your exposures that you've set. I hope this was a helpful introduction to some of these exciting changes that we've been making to the app. We'll be in the process of updating our support documentation and in-app tooltip videos to update for these recent changes in the next couple weeks. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about any of this new functionality, feel free to email us at support@sabersim.com. Thanks and good luck.